So today we have Matthew Hunter joining us, and I'm glad to have him on. He is a wilderness survival expert, has been teaching this for a long time. He's also a plant expert, particularly in foraging edible plants, and has a wealth of knowledge. Currently lives in Arizona, runs his own wilderness academy, and he's a fantastic survival instructor, and really glad to have him on here. Originally from Texas, the South, and has such a broad range of knowledge. So thank you very much for joining us, Matthew.
Thanks for having me, Lee.
Well, just to start off with, how about you just tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, how you got into this? I think that's the most exciting thing. I think when people see this, sometimes they look at, wow, I want to be a wilderness survival guy. Sounds like a fantastic life. Did you kind of grow up eating grub worms, or, just how did this all come about?
Yeah, it's so funny because I didn't grow up doing this stuff at all. I mean, I grew up, just like most millennials, watching TV, playing video games, and not going outside as much as I should. But something hit me probably like around my senior year of high school. I got the bug, and I just for something I don't know what it was. But I wanted to go and like experience the remote wilderness and actually live in the wilderness for a time. And so I don't know, for some reason I just got this fascination of wanting to sort of experience like the mountain man lifestyle, which I found out wasn't nearly as fun as I thought it would be. But I did end up doing that, and
You
so
have
I
that look. You do look like Jeremiah Johnson if you've
yeah,
seen the
yeah.
film. So
Well, you should have seen me back then. I was clean shaven and 17 long hair. I was a different person back then. But the first thing I started learning was the plants, because I figured, anyone who wants to live off the land has to learn the plants. And funny enough, the reason I started learning plants was because I figured that would be the most boring and difficult skill to learn. And so I figured I better start doing that first because it'll take me so long to learn all the plants. And well, sure enough, once I started learning them, curiosity just took over, and I started learning all these different things that Native Americans were doing to live, and the plants they were eating, and all the different uses of the plants. And so that actually ended up becoming sort of my main area of study, learning the plants. But yeah,
and
so my
this
name's
was
Matthew.
this was in Texas.
Yeah, so this was in East Texas originally, and I was preparing for a trip to go up to Montana, so the Bitterroot mountains in Montana Idaho border, and so I ended up going up there for 6 months. But yeah, yeah. So
Oh
I have a
wow!
business called Legacy Wilderness Academy, and I teach about wilderness survival and edible plants. So it's been over 10 years of doing this now.
Did you actually live in the Bitterroots then?
Yeah, yeah. I went out and lived in the Bitterroots for about 6 months, and not just purely right off the land. We were in a tent for of that time. Let's see. Well, we were in like a little hunting sort of camper for a few months in the national forest, and then we moved to a tent, and then so we were like really way out there for like at least a good month of just like deep remote wilderness, and that's sort of where it all started. And yeah, I've been
That,
traveling and doing stuff ever since.
that must have been an incredible learning experience. What was that like? And if you have a couple of stories, what did you face? Stare down a grizzly, or get caught in a blizzard, or yeah, that just sounds fascinating.
Yeah, well, it's definitely not as fun as as you would think. It's it's a lot of just boring days, and being out in the woods. It has this sort of you have this sort of romantic idea of what it's going to be like, and then you get out there and you're like, oh, this isn't nearly as much fun. But I did get to eat a lot of plants out there. I had been studying the plants of that region for months and months prior to going, and I had, I was I think 17. No, I was 19, working at a Sonic and saving every paycheck to buy
Mm.
guns and ammo and wilderness survival gear. So I was really equipped when I got there. And then when we finally got there, it was a lot of fun. Building my first shelter, and we were shooting stuff. We were shooting anything that moved. We were shooting. I had never hunted a day in my life. So I was shooting, squirrels and little birds, and just eating anything we could. And so I learned how to skin a deer when I was there, and all kinds of stuff. We were trying to put up these shelters that just were ended up horrible shelters looking back. But we got a lot of stuff done, and we ended up leaving feeling like men. And it was a good experience. I learned a lot, and I learned uh, met a lot of the local people out there, and that's really the best part of Montana and Idaho is the people. Those country rural folk. I like to say Montana is like the Texas of the North, because the people there remind me a lot of good old rural Texans. Yeah, it was a good trip. Yeah.
Yeah, learning by trial and error, right? That sounds a lot like, except it sounds like you were more prepared than if you've read the book or the movie Into the Wild, the Alexander Supertramp guy. So I'm glad
Oh
you
yeah.
made it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, well,
Well, I sort of can relate to him as much as people give him crap for going out there and doing what he did. I sort of understand it because I could have been him in a way. I think he was a little bit further than I was, and on sort of the romantic idea of the wilderness. But I definitely can relate to how you can think that the wilderness is just this beautiful, wonderful place, and then forget that it's also a deadly place. And yeah.
well, I think that's a great segue because, our country, in terms of our European ancestry, obviously Native Americans were here for a lot longer, but was founded on that pioneer spirit. And so, one of the things that maybe you could speak a little more about is, and I know you do this when you're teaching, this difference between primitive living or pioneer living, and we see a lot when people discuss survival about bushcraft, contrasting that with wilderness survival, and particularly modern wilderness survival. Can you share your thoughts on that?
Yeah, yeah. So, well, one of the first things is that Native Americans were not, for the most part, they weren't really doing survival skills. So they were living in the woods, in the wilderness, full time. And so a lot of the sort of I sort of had this idea when I first started survival. Like, I would like to be able to survive. Like, what if I had like nothing on me and I had to survive like completely primitively with only what I could find in the wilderness? Like stone tools and sticks, and how would I go about that? And I think that's the wrong place to start with wilderness survival. Um, because when you look at those types of skills that the Native Americans were doing, the main thing that makes it different is they didn't have, for the most part, didn't have metalworking, so they were using bone, stone, and wood. But I think we don't a lot of times give Native Americans enough credit for um, we call them primitive skills, but in reality, we only say that because they didn't have metal. We don't. It wasn't
Yeah,
really that they were primitive at all.
I've never liked that term. Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So the technology we say was primitive, but in reality, it was very advanced. I mean, these people were artisans, if that's the word I could use. They weren't just unprepared and just manufacturing things out of the bush, um, sort of as they needed it. I mean, these people had complex systems, and it. Well, I mean, I could go on and on, but like for example, if you want to make rope, you don't just go out in the woods and just make rope whenever you need it. You have a certain tree that you wait till a very specific time of year. You harvest it in large amounts. So we're talking about whole systems. You don't just go and make a primitive bow. You pick the right tree, that maybe you even traveled miles and miles to get, or maybe you traded it. You let it, you have to let the stave dry for a year, and then you spend hours and hours making it just perfect. And so there's this idea that sort of the Native American like primitive skills, which are really cool, but not great for a beginner who really wants to have like practical knowledge, out in the woods. And then
Yeah,
of course you
because
have the
I'm sorry to interrupt, because they take a long time to master. I mean, just when I've
yeah,
done them, it's not something, and some of them, particularly obviously like flint knapping, is some people pick that up more quickly than others, but that is not an easy skill. I remember a site here just north of here, a really old Native American site called the Galt site, and they found these points that just have all these design features that the archaeologist there calls them show off points, because they make the point weaker, but they're beautiful, right? I mean, they really were artisans, but really difficult to have these fine little indentations.
Yeah,
And I know you've told me too about, having these long ropes, really long nets they created for, capturing rabbits, and, and all this things they did in tandem. So yeah, it really was sophisticated, not at all primitive in
very
that regard.
sophisticated. And all that to say is that if you want to learn survival skills, don't start by learning Native American, what's called Native American survival skills, because you'll get a headache and it'll be way too difficult for you to master. And so that's the sort of the ending goal if you want to get into that lifestyle of, there's still people today who will go out on these primitive trips with only, buckskin clothing. Like, I mean, I've seen these groups of people who, like, they have a rule: you can only bring what you've manufactured, from the wilderness primitively, or primitively, right? Um, and those are really cool skills, but I wouldn't call them survival skills in the modern sense. So, um, where we actually get survival from is really different. Like, survival in the past 100 years has evolved into something completely different from anything we've ever had before. You know,
Yeah,
uh,
and talk a little more about that. Where did that, if I remember correctly, you make sort of a couple of differentiations. So there's primitive living, and then 150 years ago, whatever time frame, not exact, but pioneer living,
mhm,
right? Where you might have had a musket or something, but you're still living out there like Jeremiah Johnson, and
right.
it's hardcore. You can't count on modern conveniences or supplies. Certainly not, or at least not for a long period of time. You might go several months. And then modern wilderness survival. So how did that last category come about, and again makes it different from the other two?
Yeah. So, well, your sort of pioneer skills are closer to the modern wilderness survival skills, and with all three of those categories, there's a lot of overlap. So it's not that we don't use any Native American knowledge, or we don't use any pioneer knowledge, but where wilderness survival came from today, it's, well, I would argue it's a direct result of warfare, largely. Now, you do have civilian things, sports like mountaineering, skiing, right? Cross country skiing, and these types of, dog sledding, sports that people still do, and they still need those survival skills. So you do have some civilians contributing to our body of modern survival knowledge, but largely, I would argue that it's a direct result of warfare. So the very first survival school in the United States, um, was in, I think, Carson, Colorado. It moved to Stead Air Force Base in Nevada pretty early on. So that's like the early 1950s. You have the very first survival school. And that's not to say that we didn't have other types of training. Like, we didn't, we had, Arctic training schools and things like that. So there were other sort of survival type schools, but the very first, real survival school where that was their goal. Like I said, early on, they moved to Stead Air Force Base, which I think is today even still known for their SEER school, and so it was the Air Force. So it was at that time, the Air Force was still a department of the Army, and so the purpose of the survival school really probably had, two major groups of people that they were concerned with. The main group was pilots. So the original survival knowledge we have today originated with pilots. So what they found in, World War II, was that a lot of pilots were going down in their plane, and were actually surviving the crash, and then they were dying from the elements uh, after the initial crash. Okay, so you got to think pilots, very very valuable people, uh, in World War II, right? We need pilots. You lose good pilots, you have a bunch of,
Lots of
you know,
training involved there.
right, lots of
Yeah.
training involved, and you don't want to have rookie pilots fighting, the other side with veteran pilots. So they're no match. So pilots are valuable, very valuable assets to the military, as you can imagine. And so the very first school was actually really made for pilots. And the goal was to teach pilots how to survive in Arctic conditions, desert conditions, and, jungle conditions. And then the second group of people we're really concerned with was people in the Navy. So, uh, uh, you know, uh, sea survivors, right? Your ship goes down and you have all of these people, hundreds or, maybe even thousands of people who are dying at sea. And so the next question was, what do you do whenever you're at, like, um, how do you survive at sea? And so we get books sort of like this, United States Air Force search and rescue survival. And so understanding where survival actually came from, it starts to make a lot more sense. Like, why in a survival book am I reading about which fish are poisonous? Like that's a really strange, because in the US we don't have any like really poisonous fish that I know of, maybe like one or two. But you're like, how? I don't understand why. It's like such strange topics they choose to cover in these survival manuals. But when you look at like where that information came from, people were getting poisoned by fish in the Pacific because there's more poisonous fish out there. So they're catching fish off their life raft and getting poisoned. And you see like how to use a parachute as a shelter, and you're like, how is this practical? Like, who has a parachute? You're like, oh, that's because this information came from the military originally. And so Stead Air Force Base, what became a central point where all of the survival information could sort of flow to. And so they started interviewing pilots and interviewing people who survived, sea incidents, and asking them, what did you do? What did you do wrong? How did people die? And they started compiling all this information, and along with that, with other things too, with the Cold War era, the United States was just in a perpetual state of anxiety, getting ready for another potential war. And so that's when a lot of money became available for research. And so, for example, the what's called the golden age of frostbite research was in like the 50s and 60s, where you're learning all about the human body. You're getting these new insights. I think it was in like the 50s and 60s where the protocol for actually treating frostbite, changed after hundreds of years of people doing one thing. They change and say, oh, actually that was not effective, we're going to start treating frostbite this way. And so they start actually doing these scientific studies, learning about the human body, and having this central point where all the survival information can sort of flow to. And you have people who at the instructors, and it's their full-time job to come up with new survival methods and to compile this information and to make something with it. And so largely warfare, and even back in World War II, research and study different types of studies that were done, which I talk about in my course. Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great answer. Thank you. I actually have a family connection on that. My uncle was a POW shot down in Korea
Wow.
and nearly froze to death. And unfortunately, he got well, maybe it was a good thing actually in the end, but he got captured right away. So the evasion part of series, survival, evasion, resistance, escape, he didn't get too far past the second letter. But yeah, they tried to freeze him to death on a couple occasions. And actually, he learned a lot. And he's told me a lot of these stories, and I can see exactly what you're talking about. In fact, a Jack London book, he kind of credits to saving his life in terms of he was recognizing one night he was about to freeze to death and
Yeah.
started exercising. So that's makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. When you think of Korea, Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where you have this huge amount of frostbite casualties and people dying from the cold, and then that spurs research, because now the government is like, oh, we need to start researching how to prevent this. And so the information that was originated with government research we're still using today.
so that's actually a great entree into the next topic, which is if that's how modern survival came about, and we learned all these techniques. Um, Fortunately, we're not in major wars today, and so, but we do have people who get into survival situations, obviously. a lot of it, maybe almost all of it, recreationally, not all of it. But what are the main causes? I know you've done a lot of research on this. Today when people get in these situations, what typically leads to those?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. And so, the first for thing you'll find when you start researching survival situations, how people have died in the wilderness or near death experiences. One of the interesting things is that um, there's like a striking resemblance between different situations. I mean, it could have happened at different parts of the world, and the people were doing completely different activities. One's mountain climbing, one's boating, or whatever. And but if you really look at like how did what were the things that the five different things the person did wrong, and you sort of boil it all down, there is a really striking resemblance between all these different situations where you can sort of boil it all down to like a list. And that's what I've done with my course. I have a list of like 15 or so mistakes. And what I teach my students, if I could sum it all up in one sentence, it would be um, not being prepared. So not preparing beforehand to be in the wilderness. And so a lot of what kills people, like for example, even in the Phoenix area where I'm at, every year people die from heat stroke. And so one of the biggest things is, well, it's what I call the day hiker mentality. It's the idea that, I'm only going out for the day. And so I'm only going to prepare for the 4-hour hike I'm planning on going on and nothing more. And so ultimately, oh, sorry, I got an alarm going off. So ultimately, it boils down to that. So, like for example, here in Phoenix, people don't realize that you would think like you see like a movie where they're dying in the desert and they're running out of water slowly, and well, in reality, most actually almost all of the people that die here in Phoenix from the heat, they don't die from dehydration. They actually die from heat stroke. So it is, sort of related to dehydration, but they're not like running out of water and sitting under a tree and slowly wasting away. It usually happens a lot quicker than that. Most of the people last year who died out in the desert, actually all of the ones I saw reported by the news, um, they died within one day. So they died on a day hike and died from heat stroke within one day. So I'm talking about a few hours. Like they just go out for a hike, think they're going to be back at their car in a few hours, and they either get lost, a little bit turned around, they forget, they didn't bring water, and it's actually amazing how fast people can die in the wilderness, just about anywhere. Um, but largely, it's a lack of preparedness, right? That's why the Boy Scout motto is be prepared, because it really is simple, but I think a lot of people sort of fantasize survival and sort of have this idea of what it's what it's going to be like, when in reality sometimes it's survival skills and wilderness comfort is something as simple as wear pants instead of shorts so the mosquitoes don't tear your legs up all night, or something as simple as that. Hey, tell someone where you're going to be, bring a compass. A lot of times it's more simple. Now there is, that's not to say that learning survival is always simple like that, but some of the things that are going to kill you, you really don't even have to learn any fancy skills. You just have to learn what not to do. So a lot of my job as a survival instructor is telling people what not to do, so how to prepare and how to not get yourself in a crazy situation to begin with.
And I think that's a great point because, again, contrasting with primitive living, the idea of primitive living, and I've been out and done some, not as long as you have, but gone out for extended periods of time, and it's really enjoyable. It's like if you have everything right, it's like, hey, I'd like to stay out here. But that's very different from a survival situation. And I think you point this out really well when you're teaching, in that it's usually going to be a short duration, one way or the other. You're either going to make it out, however you make it out, and we'll talk about that more in a minute, or you're not. But it's really about being prepared, not to live there, but having the things with you, and doing your homework so that you can make it through this next really cold night, right? Um, and, or find some water, like you were talking about people, out in Arizona, where obviously it's very hot in the summer. And so I think that's, again, that was kind of an eye opener for me, just from a contextual standpoint, a way of looking at things. It's very different from, like you said, this kind of glorious, well, I'm going to turn into a Native American and, catch a buffalo and,
Yeah.
you know, put them on a split and, kick back in my hammock. And, that's not really what we mean by survival situations, is it?
No, yeah, and I think a lot of survival training is sort of geared, in my opinion, sort of in the wrong way. It's sort of geared for what people want and not for what people need.
Mm,
So if you were to go on YouTube right now and see and type in wilderness survival and see like all the top videos that have millions of views, it's mostly people like living in the wood, like, doing like how to build this crazy big shelter out of nothing and stuff like that, because that's what we want, that's what we think about, and that's what we really want deep down. But if I'm going to train someone to do like wilderness survival, like if you were going shipped off to a war zone tomorrow and I could teach you, and I had like a weekend with you to teach you wilderness survival skills, I wouldn't be teaching you how to trap animals, primitively, or how to build. Maybe I might teach you how to build a shelter, but more realistically, I'd probably teach you how to tie a few knots so you could set up a tarp. um, you know, a lot of people want to learn these sort of primitive skills, but I think the real survival skills are they're a lot more surprisingly academic. Like there's quite a bit you can learn scientifically about wilderness survival, but it's definitely not as like it's not as fun. It's not as fun, and that's one of the problems I'm having even selling my course is that I'm trying to give people what they need, but not what they want. So what people want is entertainment, is entertaining. What I'm trying to give them is not necessarily entertaining. It's not really fun to learn how to like navigate with the map and compass. It's actually like kind of like learning math. Like you don't really want to do it. Um, it's learning like how to prevent frostbite and hypothermia isn't really fun. It's not like, oh yeah, that's going to be awesome, let me watch a video on like how the body responds to the cold. It's not really fun. It's more like it's like, you should do it to be responsible. And so I'm even having trouble. I wouldn't
well,
say I'm having trouble selling my course. I'm having trouble positioning it to, because I don't want to be dishonest and be like, you're gonna be a
yeah.
master at living in
Well,
the woods.
I love navigating, but that's kind of, I think it's interesting. But anyway, well, actually, just getting into a few specifics here, how hard is it to prepare? I mean, just, taking a few things, maybe you're not going to become a master, in orienteering or navigating, but, being able to pack the right things, whether it's a day pack or a backpack trip. Cause I find personally, and I've done, a lot of backcountry backpacking, just having a few key tips, like you said, about knots, or, knowing how to, some basic ideas about repairs or dealing with this situation, it's incredibly valuable. And so are there things people can learn fairly quickly, to prepare themselves? Or I know you've done a lot of work on, being able to tell people, and even, for me, I was a little astounded about, when you're out in a desert environment, how fast you can lose water, and particularly if you're carrying weight, or, you can really run into some problems very quickly. Um, but are there some things you can do to help offset that, and, that are practical, and, someone can learn or prepare, fairly quickly?
Yeah, yeah. Actually, you can learn, some of the most important survival skills really quickly, because, like I said, it's mostly learning what not to do in a lot of ways. But it's really not learning it; it's the discipline of actually doing it. And so, what I tell my students is, I could teach you how to put on a seat belt in, 30 seconds. I could explain what it's for. I could tell you the statistics of why you should do it. But if you don't do it every single time, it's not going to really be worth anything to you. So it's not just learning. And sometimes I have to really stress some of the points to my students because I feel like it's so simple. It's like, oh, I already know that, wear your seatbelt. Oh, I already know that. And it's so easy to just be like, well, that's easy, of course. But it's another thing altogether to actually do it every time. So that's what takes the discipline. It's, hey, how do you not get a flat tire when you're way out in the desert? Well, you have to check the air pressure in your tires. You have to check the tread. you may even have to pay a few $100s to get a couple of your tires replaced. And so that's the discipline aspect of it. And it's also, putting all of that together. I could teach you how to read a map, but if you didn't print one out for your area, you didn't take the 30 minutes to find one, print one out, or you didn't even look at it before you left, or you have a compass, but you left it in your backpack. And when you got out of your car and started hiking, you didn't even look at it. A lot of it's really simple. You can learn it relatively quickly, but I think it's the ingraining it into the back of your mind where you always do it without thinking. That's the real, survival knowledge. So
I,
some of it can be pretty simple, but it's another thing altogether to actually do it every time.
I think that's a great point, and I mean, I should know better, but I've made that mistake before. I think something that goes along with that is that people, particularly if they know an area or maybe they know it a little bit or they've had experience there before and everything went right, just assuming that the next time they go out, particularly in an area like the mountains where things can change very quickly, with the weather, that's going to be just like that again. And I think they get complacent, well, I don't need the compass or what. I personally, one time was in the Sierras, and it was right about this time of year, a few weeks later, early October. But when the weather can start changing out there, normally October's pretty nice. And so we went in, showed up. I was with a buddy of mine and got to the gate, and it was cold. I mean, we're at only like 4,500 feet, and it's like 45 degrees. And I asked the ranger, he goes, "Yeah, we don't usually get this till Thanksgiving." And so that should have been a light bulb moment. And we get in camp, at the campground the first night. We're going in for like 2 weeks. And we go in the first night, and I had a tent, one of these that has a tarp on the bottom. But if you want to save weight, 'cause we were going in a long time, you can just take the fly with the tarp. And, we went in about, I don't know, probably 8 miles first day, camped. And I tell you what, it was so cold that night. And we were only at, 6,000 to 7,000 feet. We're going up to 13. And my friend, he's a pretty tough guy. He wanted to keep going. I was like, nope, no way. I went 6 miles that morning, ran down to the car, got the rest of my tent, ran back up, made really good time, got back in about 3 hours and continued. And, I was very tired that day, but thank goodness it did that, because I tell you what, we got up. I mean, it was bitterly cold, up in the top, and we would have had a real problem, and it just would have been stupidity.
Yeah.
Just would have been a dumb mistake. So
And
I
that
think
that
that's really
actually
good advice.
describes most survival situations in the United States. It's not this, extended ordeal where it's this, fight for your life. And well, it is fighting for your life, but it's not this, um, oh, I need to trap a raccoon to survive and build this fancy shelter. Sometimes I guess, shelter building comes in, and I'm not, it's important to learn that stuff, but it's much more mundane. It's much more everyday stuff, situations. It's a lot more simple. It's something as simple as, hey, if you would have brought an extra hat, a jacket, maybe a sleeping pad, thickened up your bag a little bit, maybe brought a little bit heavier sleeping bag, you would have been all good. Whereas if you didn't turn around and go get your stuff, you could have got into a serious, situation. And I think a lot of survival situations are fall into that category more than people want to admit.
Yeah, and for people listening, I know that you know so much about this, and you said this earlier. It really is a crossover between the traditional skills and modern, because Native Americans might not have been able to tell you about conduction or convection, but they sure knew about it,
Oh
right?
yeah.
I mean, scientifically, they may not have been able to do the math on or whatever, and they would have said, no, don't. You're not going to sleep on a rock, at
Yeah.
night when it's cold. You're going to have to get off that ground, get some insulation. And I think you do a really good job explaining the science, in a modern framework, and how important that is. Because if you understand those things and you find yourself, hopefully not, but you find yourself in one of these situations, or just for comfort, and the story I mentioned a while ago, you can make some really good decisions that can either keep you from getting in trouble, right? Or, if you do get in trouble, something happens, can keep you alive until you can get out. Um,
Yeah.
and sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, and a lot of it is comfort. So, a lot of people think of survival skills that they are sort of like like insurance. Like, oh, that's it. I'm going to take a survival course. for the 1 in a million chance that I get into a survival situation. And that's just really not how I teach. I teach from a very practical standpoint. So whenever you take my survival course, you're not just going to learn what to do in that 1 in a million chance, but it's made to make you more comfortable, because at the end of the day, that's what survival is staying comfortable, versus being cold or being dehydrated or being hot or whatever. And so a lot of it really, for people who do want to live in the woods, um learning the actual wilderness survival is like a prerequisite. So I love it when people want to learn primitive skills and the wilderness living and how to build use an axe and build a cool shelter. And that's all, really fun, awesome skills. But the prerequisite to all of that is the more basic, survival skills.
And yeah, if you do find yourself in a bad situation and your comfort level, the cold's taking it out of you, you're dehydrated. Obviously, you're probably gonna be limited on food. Insects are bothering you. That brings your whole system down. And I've heard you talk about more stressors, and that lessens your survival chances if things get really bad. Just a few things in particular. And I think a lot of people know this who are experienced, particularly like in the mountains, but clothing is really important, right? And is that
Yeah.
something people overlook a lot of times or don't take the right things?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I more than overlook, I think it's just completely just absolutely ignored. No, people in the north are a little bit better. They know they grew up learning to dress in layers and to have your little base layer, and to maybe even wear a hat and a scarf, and things like that. Um, but a lot of people who, like, for you and me, I don't know, did you grow up in Texas?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So Texans, I was watching King of the Hill last night, and on one of the episodes, it started snowing, and they said the people of Arlen are not prepared for this. They don't know what to do, and says this whole thing about getting propane to the people, and you know, um,
I love that show.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's very much like that. It's that, like, we Texans, we don't know what to do when it gets cold.
Yeah.
And well, all jokes aside though, you did see that, what was it, two winters ago?
I was here. I lived through it. I lost power. It was yeah, it was the winter of 2021.
Yeah,
And when it started coming on, I did some basic things, and I knew the pipe's going to freeze, filled my bathtubs up, and then I kind of had fun with it. I think I told you this. I went and made a snow shelter and stayed in it one night. But I
yeah,
mean, it was, some people were really struggling, and the communities were not at all, and obviously the power grid wasn't set up to deal with that. And so, fortunately, I think if it had lasted much longer, it would have started being a real problem.
yeah,
Uh, you know, but anyway, it certainly wasn't comfortable for a lot of people, and a lot of people didn't know what to do.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you have people dying in their own home. It's really sad, and I felt, helpless over here in Arizona, and being from Texas, it kind of hit me like, man, I could actually be helping people out there. um, you know, but it's, people are dying in their own home when it's, what, 30 degrees outside or something like that. And, people have lived at, over 100 degrees lower than that. Arctic explorers and stuff like that have been out in, 100 degrees lower than that. Um, at like 70 below, and been able to survive. So, it definitely, having the survival skills, knowing what to wear. And I think we're about to see that again, Lee. At least that's what people are saying in Europe right now, because of all of the shortages on natural gas. And a lot of people are thinking that when winter comes around, there's going to be people who, are going to be needing heat and not having it. So that's kind of scary. But yeah, clothing is definitely a major factor. And there's literally whole books that have been written about clothing, and some that are even too advanced for me to understand. Science, like engineers writing like the science of clothing. And there's a lot of things in the modern day that the technology that's came out in studies that people neglect. But definitely here, even in the desert, you know, people don't realize you need to wear long clothes instead of shorts and a t-shirt, and that's actually going to help you stay protected from the sun. So yeah, it's a major factor in everything we do, is how we dress.
Yeah, I think, and I know just from personal experience, you're very well versed in that. you may be underselling yourself, but understanding about evaporation and insensible perspiration and layering, and there really is a lot you can do. And as you say, particularly with these modern garments, of course, now they're getting into sort of nanotechnology, and yeah, that gets pretty sophisticated, but you certainly can do things to protect yourself and prevent from, and again, I've done stupid things before. You learn, wearing cotton shirt, and all of a sudden a big front comes in, you're soaked, and that's just not a place you want to be. Um, a couple other items, people commonly think about in survival in terms of skills. Maybe you can speak to one of them is fire, and I know a lot of people think, oh, I can start a fire or whatever. But I tell you what, when you get out there and if the conditions aren't right, it can be very challenging. And that's such a crucial thing, both in terms of just maintaining body heat, but it's also psychologically very important.
Yeah. Yeah, I tell my students that if there was one skill that could really save your life more than almost any other skill, other than just being prepared in general, I would say fire is the number one skill. Because, well, when you look at how people actually die in the wilderness, I'd say a lot of people surprisingly die from slipping and falling. That's probably like the number one way people die. But as far as like practical everyday, how are you like if I was to ask you what are the most miserable times you've had in the wilderness, I guarantee probably on the top three would be a time you were really, really cold and miserable.
Mm.
And the couple times I've had, near death experiences in the wilderness, it was from the cold as well, you know. And so yeah, fire is a major thing. And I actually just taught a lesson yesterday to my students on the importance of fire. And a lot of people don't realize you need a 6 foot long fire to stay warm in the wilderness. You can't have a little campfire because it'll only warm a part, like one part of your body, and so you actually have to have like a 6 foot long fire. And then the amount of wood you need to
Yeah.
last a night, I think most most
They
people don't
way
realize.
underestimate that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
you need like a pickup truck full of,
Yeah.
a piles of wood.
A whole
Um,
cord almost. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, seriously. I mean, especially if you're using like softwoods like pine or something, it burns a lot quicker than hardwoods. You need a lot of wood.
Or
And
if it's desiccated, it just goes fast,
yeah,
Yeah.
and let's see, what was I going to say? So yeah, staying warm is
Well,
with
and
fire. Yeah.
just the lighting one can be so
Oh,
challenging.
here's what I was going to say. So I tell my students, if you need to practice fire lighting in like the worst possible conditions.
Yeah.
And there are people who will try to say, that you should have an extra, sleeping bag and have the cold weather clothing because you might not always be able to get a fire started. And I would say that if you can't get a fire started, you're not practicing enough. I tell my students, you need to be practicing in the worst possible conditions, while it's raining or after it's rained for multiple days straight. And if you haven't failed at getting a fire started at least, five or 10 times, which means if you haven't went out, tried for, 30 minutes to an hour to get a fire started and then failed and had to give up, if you haven't done that at least 5 times, then you're not going to be ready when you really need it. So you should be practicing in such conditions that you can't get a fire started. And then once you can't get a fire started 5 to 10 times, and then eventually you overcome that, then okay, now I know I can get a fire started because I failed enough times and I finally started to overcome. And so I would say that to anyone watching, that if you think you can get a fire in any circumstance, well, how many times have you failed at getting a fire? Because I had to not be able to get a fire a few times before I got good enough. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. I have a couple of personal experiences with that in the wilderness, New Mexico, where it took me over an hour. I mean, one time it took me almost 2 hours, and everything was wet, and there's some tricks you can do to help, and finally got it going. And it wasn't a life or death situation, but I think about that. If it were, I'd be really nervous. I mean, and that's another thing. I think it's a good reminder. You're talking about how people don't prepare. I have a practice of I try to remind myself whenever I go in the backcountry, yeah, chances are everything's going to go all right, or if something did happen, you run across somebody, but you can't be guaranteed of that. And so sometimes I'll just stop and just remind myself, maybe a beautiful day. I feel great. I have everything I need, but I'm back in here 30 miles. And if somehow, like you mentioned, slipping and falling, it can change like that.
Right.
And so I need to be prepared and keep my wits about me. And also, I need to not take things for granted. One of my favorite expressions is, in terms of that, is don't take chances. It's okay to take calculated risks. Like I may want to go up to this peak to get this view, and there's a payoff for that, but don't do stupid things. Like you said, leave your compass at home. There's no reason for that, right? You're just taking a chance. I mean, yeah, you save a little weight, but is that really worth it? And so I just try to remind myself that, because you can really get sucked in and just think everything's going to go just hunky dory.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to read a quote from my very first lesson on survival, my introduction. I try to have like a relevant quote at the beginning. So the quote for my very first lesson is, it might seem, or sorry, it might almost seem as if with the aid of modern equipment and science, man had overcome natural hazards. But this is an illusion, the very illusion by which most amateur adventure seekers are deceived. And so
Absolutely,
that's
absolutely
a
true.
core Christian tropes, art of survival. And so, yeah, we tend to think because we live in a modern time, and because, I mean, you could die and literally be able to see the lights of the highway, but you just can't get there in time to do anything about it. We tend to forget, as modern people, with all of our equipment, and you're always a phone call away from ambulance, and you can always just drive to the store, and not a lot can really go wrong here in the city, or in the town, but we sort of forget how vulnerable we actually are out in the backcountry. And a lot of people, even people who are more self-sufficient, a lot of people forget how self-sufficient you truly have to be in the backcountry.
I have a good friend of mine who was out at Los Sands in New Mexico, and just went out for a day hike with his girlfriend. Left his shoes there, walking barefoot. It's a nice day. It might have been like late spring or maybe early fall, and they got lost, which a lot of people do at White Sands. And we're going through, and then darkness came on, and they had no idea where they were. And I guess it must have been overcast, so he couldn't see the sun direction. But anyway, he did know roughly where a highway was. Walked all the way through the night. She collapsed. He had to carry her like the last mile or two, and he finally got to that road about 8 o'clock in the morning. They're barefoot, and it was cold at night. And about 30 minutes after somebody picked him up, it started snowing.
Wow.
And so I
Yeah.
mean, it's like these things can happen. It happens a lot more than we think. What about Matthew? Another thing, I know you've done a lot of work on this. Can you talk a little about, and particularly in hot climates, but even in colder temperate climates, how easy it is to get dehydrated and what happens, and just then also about being able to find or save water, and just some things people should be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I have a whole lesson on dehydration, and it's an interesting lesson where I sort of trace the science of dehydration and how it happens to the body. Um, so here in the desert, dehydration can happen. A lot of people say you can last 3 days without water. Well, that's not here in the desert. You can't last that long without water. Maybe one day.
Wow.
Here in 115, it can just get brutal. But I think dehydration, a lot more than just the survival of not having water. Dehydration is a major threat even when you have water. So one of the things I teach is that in high heat, people will dehydrate themselves even when they have water readily available. So we call that voluntary dehydration.
Hmm.
And the reason for that is because you don't feel thirsty until you've already lost 2% of your body weight in water. Okay, so that would be 4 pounds. If you're 200 pounds, then you lost 2%, you lost 4 pounds of water. And that's something like 2 liters. Okay. And so think of like a 2 liter bottle, like a soda
Yeah.
bottle.
Yeah.
So if you're a 200-pound man, you may not even feel thirsty until you've lost nearly 2 liters of water from
And
your
that's a
body.
lot. That's a lot of water loss.
That's a lot of water. And so even if you're not going to die, dehydration increases your risk for frostbite. Most people who get hypothermic are actually dehydrated to some extent, most of the time. It increases your, well, obviously you get fatigued, you get exhausted, right? And it also increases your chance for a heat stroke or heat related injury. So heat exhaustion, whatever. And it, it just makes your mood go down. It makes your morale go down. And so being dehydrated a lot of times isn't even like a survival. A lot of times it is, but more it's just wilderness comfort. So understanding how to, force yourself to drink water even when you're not thirsty to offset that. But then here in the desert, there's this idea, and in a lot of survival books of, they always want to talk about like how to find water, right? And I think the modern man wants this, wants like a, sort of a magical Native American trick to find water, or like what would
Divining
Crocodile
rod.
Dundee do right now?
Yeah.
What would Jeremiah Johnson do right
Yeah.
now if they
Yeah.
needed water? Uh, and in reality, what I teach my students is if you're ever asking where to find water, you've already probably broken like 5 rules of survival to get where you are. And so you can't really, like, I always teach based off like the worst case scenario. So when I'm, teaching survival, I'm presupposing that you're going to be in the worst possible situation ever. And so when I'm presupposing that, if you're in the worst situation here in the desert, there is no water. There is none to be found. Okay. There's this sort of idea, especially when you don't live in the desert, that like there's always water somewhere in the desert. You just have to know where to find it. But that's just like simply not true. Even if you know where like a spring is, it may be dried up by the time you get there in the summer, right? It's only wet in the winter months. I've literally seen ponds dry up. It'd be a pond 1 month, 2 months later, it's like a dry, crusted hole. It's like nothing.
Last backcountry trip I did is in a desert. The spring was frozen. We were there in December, solid frozen.
Interesting.
We were able to, yeah, I mean, it was very high elevation, but we
Okay.
were able to break it open and get into it. But absolutely, I have 2 friends who are in the Gila wilderness, kind of got lost, and they didn't know where they were. And before that, they thought everything was okay. So their packs were heavy. They dumped half of their water. Major mistake, to save
Oh
weight.
man.
And they finally got down to the river, and, but they paid for it. I mean, another 3 or 4 days, they really didn't feel well. So
Yeah.
I think that's a great point. One other thing too that I know you talk about, and I find really interesting, because you're always saying about finding water, but you talk about if you find yourself in that kind of situation, there actually is quite a bit you can do, even if you don't have water, to be able to help yourself in order to save water. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah. So in desert survival, because there's usually not water available, well, first of all, you want to always, be realizing that there's not water and carrying extra water. Um, but there was some studies done. There's a book, actually I have it here behind me, called Physiology of Man in the Desert. And the fact that I even have a physical copy is somewhat of a miracle because it's out of print book, but you can get it for free online for, well, the 1% of people who would want to read it. It's more of a science type book. It's not like a real page turner by any means, but so what they talk about, so it was some studies that were done in Southern California during World War II, learning about man's sort of body water needs, dehydration, desert survival. So it is science, but it's really practical as well. And so basically the only thing you can really do if you do get into a survival situation where you don't have water is to try to conserve the water that's already in your body. So you're trying to, in the desert, that means reducing your sweat rate and reducing the other things that dehydrate you. So wearing long clothing has actually been shown scientifically to reduce your rate of dehydration. So a lot of people think you'll be hot in the desert if you wear long sleeve and pants, and you may feel a little bit hotter sometimes, but because you have that skin covered, it reduces the dehydration rate. So you're actually losing less water. And then well, if I could sum it up, it's sit under a tree all day and don't move, and then walk at night, which is generally a bad idea. I would never recommend walking around at night anytime because you can trip, you can poke your eye out. It's just a million things could happen. Even in the desert, I wouldn't recommend walking because you could, we went on like a night hike the other night with headlamps, and I was this close to stepping on a rattlesnake. My friend had to like put his arm back. So I don't recommend walking at night. But yeah, so when it comes to like not having water in the desert, the only thing you can do is reduce your water loss. And so that's the only time in a desert survival situation where you could walk at night. And there's a few other things that talk about reducing your um, keeping yourself covered, reducing your even the amount of weight in your pack can, increase. So ditch any non-essential gear that you don't really need. Just take your water. And yeah, a few other things we talk about. Yeah, that's more of a desert specific skill for the most part.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. So one thing that you don't, I think, talk a lot about or as much, and this is in a lot of survival books as well, mention this if people really read, but you do see on the TV shows or, like you said, on YouTube where it becomes about, oh, I'm going to go, kill a bush pig, right? And I'm going to eat. Can you talk a little bit about food and, again, keeping in mind that we're not talking about primitive living and staying in the wilderness indefinitely? Is that something people should be focused on, finding food, or it's something like, no, hey, listen, you can go, whatever it is, 3 weeks without food. It's like, don't worry about that. Just try to get out.
Yeah, yes and no. Yes and no. So definitely, I think most people sort of know that. They know, hey, you can go at least 3 weeks without food. I would argue you could probably go longer than that without food. I mean, you
Yeah.
could go at least 40 days.
Yeah.
And, 3 weeks, but because you're in the wilderness, you're doing a lot of heavy work and stuff like
Yeah.
that. But I think what a lot of people don't think about is, even though you won't die, you will definitely be very miserable after 1 or 2 days without food. And one of the biggest things that I think people don't think about is sugar, caffeine, and nicotine withdrawals. So most people, we were just talking about before we started this, like we're both kind of just
Yeah.
laughing, like how we're like addicted to caffeine. And so a lot of people don't think about is going with it. Oh my goodness. Even on one of those shows, I think it was Naked and Afraid, I saw someone, they were like, yeah, I'm using this show to like help me stop smoking. And they had their last cigarette on the boat about
Oh,
to get off.
wow.
And I think it was Snake and Afraid. It might have been like another one of
Yeah.
those, but they were smoking their last cigarette right before they got off the boat. And I was like, what are you doing?
Bad idea. Yeah.
So a lot of people don't think about is in a 3 day survival situation, right? We always assume like 3 days is the average, 2 to 3 days is the average survival situation, in the US, or even less than that. And maybe you would even say like get prepared for like a week. Um, well, caffeine is going to be one of your major problems. And even for a lot of people, sugar withdrawals, because a lot of people eat sugar every single day and don't even think about what they would do without it and how bad that can affect your mood. But really, another thing, a couple things I teach is that in cold weather environments, you actually do need food because again, people say, oh, you need it takes you 3 weeks to starve to death. Well, you're probably going to freeze to death before you starve to death, right? But the thing about freezing to death is that it's directly related to how much food you're eating, right? Because the body is burning energy to keep itself warm, and you have to replace that energy that it's burning. So eating food is actually important to prevent a hypothermia. When you're in a really cold environment, your body's constantly working, shivering, and to keep you warm, and you're having a hard time. Having some extra food definitely helps. And then the reverse side to that is in hot environments, a lot of people don't realize that depletion of salt from your body is oftentimes one of the causes of heat stroke. And so, if you're just drinking water only without eating for a few days out in the desert, you can still really uh, predispose yourself to getting heat stroke because of that salt. Salt is the most important electrolyte. People don't think about it like as an electrolyte, but it is. It's the electrolyte you need. So food. While you can last quite a while without starving, it is good idea to have some extra food on you, some snacks, some. A lot of people recommend putting sugar cubes in your survival kit. I've never done that, but a lot of people recommend. And then having like little like tea bags or something with a little extra caffeine. So instant coffee packets or something like that, and those can go a long way. But yeah, cold weather is the main thing where you'll really need some fat, some nice food.
I think that's a really good point because if anyone who's experienced this, I mean, even around your house or something, if you've, been fasting or for whatever reason, is that your mood changes and that's like, I'm in a bad mood. But it's not just your mood changes, your mind doesn't work as well. You're going to be more likely to have an accident. You're going to make some bad decisions. You're going to make some mistakes. You're going to fumble with things. You may not be able to do basic chores nearly as well. I mean, it really, and worst case scenario, and this obviously as a survival instructor, that it can affect your motivation. And well, I'm just going to, whatever, something's coming in, inclement weather, or you're really winding down. You don't have much. Well, I'm just going to sit down a while.
Yeah.
Or like my uncle when he was about to freeze to death, he just wanted to go to sleep. And he started getting this kind of warm feeling, which a lot of people say happens before you actually freeze to death. And so, yeah, I think that's a really good point that, even just a little bit of food, if it helps your attitude, can actually make a big difference because of what it does to your mental faculties.
Yeah, and a lot of people don't consider, like what you just said, is that the mood and everything. And a lot of people don't consider that that's on top of not getting a lot of sleep, overexerting yourself more than you maybe ever have before the previous day. You probably a little bit dehydrated already. So you may, or maybe if it's not cold and you're dealing with the heat, you probably got tore up by insects the night before. So it's not just, oh, I'm hungry or I'm a little cranky or I have caffeine withdrawals. It's that plus, 5 more different environmental stressors that just run you down. And so that's what I talk about with it, the term exposure, which is, dying from the elements. Sometimes it's just one thing like heat stroke that got you or hypothermia, but a lot of times it's a whole spiral of events where it's like 10 different things. It's, lack of sleep, overexertion, dehydration, all of those different things that spiral down, and not having food and being, or not having caffeine or whatever is just one more, that's on top of a whole lot of other things.
So, Matthew, I think that's a good way to kind of sum up the last couple items here. And I wanted to ask you if you can speak to the psychology of survival. Again, I think this is something you do hear about in the books, obviously. Some of them put it right up front, but talk about how important that is. And then also in the decision making about what you do, because a lot of survival is about, do I try to get out on my own or do I wait for someone to rescue me? So, can you speak about those two things, psychology and then the decision making on what to do if you find yourself in a situation like this?
Sure. Yeah, so I think psychology is actually overemphasized in survival, and I think it's always sort of there's always like a little chapter on having a positive mental attitude. But the point I make is that um, having a positive mental attitude is directly related to your physical well-being.
Hmm.
So you can read a chapter on having a positive mental attitude all you want, but if you're just completely run down,
Yeah.
it doesn't really matter, right? And it's sort of like what we talked about, like nicotine withdrawals, like right, uh, you know, someone who like tries to quit smoking, it doesn't matter if they know mentally that like, oh yeah, I'm having nicotine withdrawals, that's why I'm in a bad mood and like and being mean to everybody. Well, you try to tell them that and see how it works. Hey, don't worry, you're just having nicotine withdrawals. They'll say, shut up, I don't, you know. So it's really easy to write in your book, have a positive mental attitude, make sure you're viewing things positively. It's like, well, that's really hard to do when I just fell in the creek and all my stuff got wet and I can't get a fire started and I feel like I'm about to die. People don't die because they have a bad attitude. They die because they froze to death. So I don't want to, I don't want to say that, we should never talk about the psychology of survival. There's actually only really a couple books on the psychology of survival. One of them is by John Leach. And so what he talks about, his is actually about disaster survival. So it's more like for first responders, for people who are like, not so much for wilderness survival, although there is some overlap. But a lot of it is when it comes to the psychology of survival, I would say the emphasis should be on people thinking it can't happen to them. So
Yeah.
psychologically, probably the number one thing that is going to kill people is not that they had a bad attitude, which I guess that does do it. But, usually your bad attitude is because you're miserable and there's nothing you can do about it. But it's mostly because people think it can't happen to them anyway. They're not even thinking about a survival situation. And like, you talked about at the beginning of this, how your friend was like, hey, let's just keep hiking up this trail. Let's get to 13,000 feet. And you were like, no way, I'm going to go back to the car. Okay. So that's where psychologically you made the right decision. A lot of people would make the wrong decision and keep going because they don't even think, that something bad could happen to them. So I think psychologically, the number one error people make, we call it cognitive dissonance for any of the, psychology nerds out there, where it's sort of like you see one thing happening with your eyes, but you don't acknowledge that it's like a real threat. And I think, that's probably where I would put the emphasis is knowing, like, someone sitting there telling you, here's how people die in the wilderness, and then not taking the necessary steps to prevent that.
I
So
think
that's
that's a good
probably,
point from instructor because a lot of that is I see both sides to it, but I see what you're saying. You don't want to put yourself in that situation. And a lot of that's personality driven. And there are stories of people just unbelievable what they, were willing to bear, or, the old guys like, Shackleton, who's
yeah,
exploring, and guys up crossing the North Pole, Edmondson, these guys. But a lot of times, and everyone says this, you don't really know for sure how you're going to respond until you're in that situation. If, you're one of those, and like you said, you may just freeze to death anyway. So why put yourself in that position if you cannot,
yeah,
and I think that's a really good point. In any event, if you're in a situation like that, can you talk to people about this whole idea of trying to get out on your own versus waiting for rescue, and what goes into that? Is there a hard and fast rule? Or does it just depend on the circumstances? Yeah.
yeah.
How would you advise people?
Yeah. Yeah. And really quickly with people like Shackleton, I also don't want to say, I don't want to just completely discount what people write in survival books. So I'm not saying, the positive mental attitude is not a good thing to talk about, but I just want to also place the emphasis, like there is different types of personalities, and
Right.
some people just have a personality where you're going to respond in a completely wrong way and have a
Yeah.
horrible attitude. And so for those types of people, you need to just if you have a backpack full of equipment, you can have the worst attitude in the world, but you have a backpack full of equipment, so you're good. And the flip side is you can have the best attitude of anybody and still die. And that's
Mm.
sort of the point I was trying to get at. But you do have the Shackleton types where it's like, you know, really, getting like having the discipline. It's really discipline. That's where it's not positive mental
Mm.
attitude. It's discipline.
Mm.
It's self-control and discipline. It's the people. Yeah. But anyway, that's a different topic. So the question is, when to signal for rescue or when to strike out on your own and try to find your way back. Yeah, I think this is another place where people have this misconception that, well, it's like self-rescue. Self-rescue is not really happen a whole lot in the wilderness. Probably, I mean, there's always survival situations that people don't report and things like that, near death things where people got out on their own. Of course, we don't have records of that. But I think a lot of times people don't recognize that being rescued in the wilderness is the most likely outcome to your survival situation. When you get lost, when I mean, there's always these. My wife always sends me articles about people getting rescued out of the Grand Canyon. People, someone and his dog got rescued by a helicopter because they were, on the verge of heat stroke. And in fact, the wilderness survival instructor Jessie Krebs, she has the masterclass survival course uh, and she's a SEER instructor, right? So military trained SEER instructor. She says that signaling for rescue is like the number one survival skill in her opinion. So like in her opinion, the number one thing you should learn first is how to signal for rescue. And so, and I would, sort of agree that that's one of the top, things. People always say like shelter, water, fire, food. Those are the four. Well,
Mm.
that's not realistic because you didn't even add first aid, first of all. And, like I said, most people in the wilderness die from slipping and falling and heart issues. Those are the two
Mm.
top killers in the wilderness: cardiac issues, slipping and falling. So probably a real survivalist would know how to, fix a
Mm.
sprained ankle is like the first thing you should, which is kind of not really how we think of survival. Um, but signaling for rescue is absolutely important. And it is one of the most foundational things for survival training is, telling someone where you're going to be and exactly when you plan to get back and what time to call search and rescue if you don't show up. And I have to do that every time I go out because I could drive 30 minutes away, hike down the trail for 20 minutes. And if I got lost right there, I would be toast, right? Because sometimes it's over 100 degrees, over 110 when I'm out filming. I mean, my camera's overheating and gets so hot. And I'm in the wilderness. I could get in the wilderness pretty quick, So telling someone where you're going to be, because if you do get lost, which is one of the most common ways people get in survival situations in the modern day, like in the Everglades, in the desert, even in the mountains, people getting lost is probably the root cause of so many survival situations. And when you're lost, there's not a lot you can do if you weren't prepared, right? If you don't have any GPS to signal, anything like that. And so you're really, really, really just hoping that someone is looking for you. And even knowing that someone's looking for you is a really, psychologically helpful thing, is when someone's looking for you. So you should always, signaling for rescue is one of, if you're lost, you don't know which direction to head, is best just to sit still and wait for someone. Hopefully you have a whistle you can like sort of blow. People can hear you far away. Maybe you have in the desert, a signal mirror is a really good device you can have. Whatever it is, maybe an air horn, depending on the type of, region you're in, whatever. And so, yeah, signaling is actually one of the main things. And in a lot of areas, you can't get out. Like, for example, if you're in a car, um, people actually die here in the desert because they get stuck in their car breaks down in the desert, and they're too far away for them to walk back. So you're really hoping that someone rescues you. So one of the major survival tenets that I myself follow is tell someone where you're going to be, what direction you're heading once you get to that place, when you're supposed to be back. And I even tell my wife, hey, if I'm not back at this time, call search and rescue, or at least come and have someone drive and see if maybe the car like broke down or something like that. And I even have a GPS now, of course, a signaling device that I just keep off, and I just turn it on. I can send a text message from anywhere in the world, and it has my GPS coordinates. So I'm pretty safe for the most part. But and even though I have that GPS, I still have a map, a compass, and my signaling equipment, and I tell my wife. So I'm like covered all my bases, But yeah, so signaling is a lot more important than people recognize.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much for that. That was a fantastic way to wrap here, and really appreciate all the information, the wealth of knowledge, and obviously that comes from not only research but experience. So it's been a pleasure, and hope to have you on again sometime.
Thanks so much for having me, Lee. It's a pleasure.
Okay. All right. Take care.